The system of names in ancient Rome holds mysteries that go far beyond the simple way of identifying people. Did you know that a Roman's name could tell his entire story? It revealed not only who he was, but also where he came from, what family he belonged to, and often even his social status. This system, called praenomina, was so detailed that it almost functioned as a social code. Imagine a society where each name carried a universe of meaning. At the heart of it all were three main parts: the forename, the nomen, and the cognomen. But what did each of these parts say about an individual? And why were they so important? The forename, which would be equivalent to what we know today as a first name, was used only among close friends and family. It was almost a privilege to be able to use this name to address someone, since it symbolized intimacy. There were a limited number of forenames in use, and many of them were passed down from generation to generation. For example, names such as Gaius, Lucius, and Marcus were common and widely recognized. However, the forename by itself said little about a person. Their true identity lay in the name that came after them, the nomen. The nomen was the name of the family or clan to which a person belonged, what the Romans called a gens. It was this name that connected an individual to his or her lineage and indicated which group he or she belonged to within the complex Roman social hierarchy. Belonging to a powerful gens could open doors and guarantee a life full of opportunities. Imagine hearing the name Julius and immediately associating it with the family that gave rise to figures like the famous Caesar. The nomen not only identified, but also carried with it a legacy of prestige, or in some cases, obligations. It was a name that spoke louder than words and could determine the course of a person's life. Finally, there was the cognomen, which functioned as a kind of nickname or additional title. This element was especially fascinating because it was here that individual peculiarities came into play. A cognomen could highlight a physical characteristic, such as Cicero, meaning chickpea, perhaps a reference to a mole or mark on the face, or a notable achievement. It was common for men who distinguished themselves in battle or had accomplished something remarkable to be given cognomina in recognition. Over time, these nicknames could become hereditary, creating subgroups within the gens themselves. And it was not uncommon for people to accumulate more than one cognomen, adding even more depth to the meaning of their names. This naming structure was not just a practical system, it reflected the organization of Roman society. Each layer of the name represented a different aspect of identity, and knowing someone's full name meant knowing a great deal about their position and history. For example, Caesar's full name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius was his given name, used by those closest to him. Julius indicated that he belonged to the gens Julia, one of the oldest and most respected in Rome. And Caesar? Although the exact origins of this cognomen are debated, it has been associated with aspects as varied as an achievement or a personal characteristic. And then, over time, the name Caesar became a symbol of power, being adopted as a title by other emperors. This hierarchy of names also had a profound impact on social and political relations. The simple act of introducing yourself using your praenomina could determine how you would be treated. Someone from an illustrious gens was more likely to be welcomed into political circles, while a common name could limit opportunities. And here, an interesting question arises. How did this intricate structure influence the dynamics between the different social groups in Rome? At the same time, not everyone followed these conventions strictly. Slaves, for example, had simple functional names, often defined by their masters. However, upon gaining their freedom, they adopted a full Roman name, as if claiming a place in this complex social network. This transformation was a reflection of how names were deeply connected to identity and social position. The dynamics of the praenomina system also allowed for peculiarities and exceptions. There were cases in which people changed their names for political or religious reasons. Some men added extra cognomina to reinforce alliances or mark specific accomplishments. Others, upon adopting Roman citizenship, were given new names that reflected their godfathers or protectors. These nuances make clear how names in Rome went far beyond mere etiquette. They were tools of negotiation and self-expression. But amidst so many rules and meanings, what happened when someone broke the conventions? How did society react to a name that did not follow the norm? These deviations reveal even more about Roman values and how they dealt with the complexities of such a diverse society. It is precisely this wealth of details and stories that leads us to the next question. What did female names say about the role of women in ancient Rome? Is there anything that has struck you so far? Share it in the comments. Your opinion is important. Women in ancient Rome had a relationship with their names that reflected their position within society. Unlike men, who had their names structured in 3 parts, women were generally identified only by their nomen, that is, the name of the family or clan to which they belonged. This apparent simplicity hid a universe of meaning, since the nomen was not just a label, but an affirmation of belonging. For example, a woman from the Julia family would be called Julia without a first name or surname. But how could the different Julias within the same family be distinguished? The distinction was marked in creative ways. One of the most common was the use of additional adjectives or descriptions, such as mayor and minor. Thus, Julia Mayor would be the eldest, while Julia Menna indicated the youngest. This created an interesting dynamic, where the context itself determined a person's identity. In some cases, women were given nicknames based on personality traits or appearance, which added a personal layer to their identity. These practices reflected not only the simplicity of the female system, but also its adaptation to social and familial needs. Women, however, also played important roles in perpetuating the prestige of their families. When they married, they usually kept their birth nomen, indicating the continuity of their connection to the original genes. This was especially relevant in political and social alliances, where a woman's name could symbolize a link between 2 powerful families. There were also cases in which women gained enough prominence for their names to become known outside the family circle, such as Livia Drusa, wife of Augustus, who influenced political decisions and consolidated the power of her lineage. Another curious aspect was the way in which women's names could reflect changes in their status. For example, a freed woman of slave origin could adopt the nomen of her former master, similar to what happened to men. This was seen as a form of social advancement and also of gratitude. This dynamic created an interesting contrast between the limitations imposed on women and the symbolic opportunities that names could offer. However, it is important to remember that in a society where power was predominantly male, women's naming system was more a reflection of their secondary role. They were, in many cases, defined by their relationships with men, daughters of their fathers, wives of their husbands, but at the same time, names offered a window into understanding how women positioned themselves within these structures. Could this simplicity also hide forms of resistance or self-affirmation? And how did these names connect to the cultural and historical practices of the time? Interestingly, the practice of naming women in an apparently simplified way reveals a lot about the functional nature of Roman society. The nomen was enough to indicate the importance of the clan to which the woman belonged. In a political and social scenario where alliances were crucial, knowing a woman's family name could be the key to understanding her relevance within the dynamics of power. It is fascinating to think that even in such a patriarchal system, women had their names as symbols of family continuity and representation. This detail leads us to reflect. How did female names influence, directly or indirectly, power strategies in ancient Rome? In addition, women's names also became a cultural and literary tool. In Roman poetry and prose, female names often carried symbolism that transcended their practical function. Writers such as Ovid and Virgil used female names to evoke feelings, connect mythological stories, or represent social ideals. These literary records give us clues about how Romans viewed their women and the role their names played in the cultural narrative of the time. In contrast, women from less privileged classes or slaves often did not have a nomen that conveyed prestige or heritage. Their names could be descriptive, simple, or even given by their masters. However, upon their liberation, many enslaved women adopted their master's nomen as a symbolic act of belonging and a new beginning. This highlights the transformative power that names had in Roman society. They not only identified but also reconfigured a person's position in the social fabric. On the other hand, women of historical prominence, such as Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, show that female names could transcend social limitations and become symbols of virtue and influence. Cornelia, often referred to as a model of motherhood and morality, used her name to strengthen her family's legacy. Her example raises the question of how other Roman women used their names to create narratives of their own in a society that offered them so few tools to do so. The naming system of Roman women also inspired future practices in other cultures and eras. Many Roman feminine names have been adapted to modern languages and continue to be used today, carrying with them centuries of history and meaning. Names such as Julia, Livia, and Claudia are clear examples of this heritage, which remains alive in the daily lives of many societies around the world. They remind us that even in a structure that seemed secondary, feminine names had their strength and longevity. Finally, the analysis of feminine names in ancient Rome leads us to realize how these apparently simple elements carried an immense symbolic weight. Each name was a fragment of identity, a key to understanding alliances, lineages, and even cultural values. This simplicity, full of meaning, makes us wonder, were the names of Roman women really a reflection of their subordinate position, or did they hide deeper layers of power and influence? And how do these names connect to the names of slaves and freedmen, who also sought space in this complex society? The names of slaves in ancient Rome carried stories of oppression, resilience, and transformation. Unlike free Roman citizens who had complex names rich in meaning, slaves were often given simple names, often descriptive or associated with their geographical origin. These names were not chosen by the slaves themselves, but rather assigned by their masters, which reinforced their control over their identities. However, these same identities could change dramatically once the slave was freed, revealing a fascinating dynamic of power and belonging. In ancient Rome, slaves were often named after physical characteristics, personality traits, or places of origin. For example, names such as Felix, Lucky, Niger, Black, or Gracchus, Greek, were common. These simplified names often had a utilitarian or even derogatory tone, emphasizing the view of slaves as property rather than individuals. Yet for some slaves, these names were all they had as a symbol of identity in a society that viewed them as tools. Interestingly, the naming system also reflected the vast scope of the Roman Empire. Slaves captured in distant regions bore exotic names that indicated their origins. For example, a slave from Germany might be called Germanicus, while one from Thrace might be identified as Thracius. These names were not only labels, but also reminders of Rome's expansive power and the diversity of people who lived under its rule. This naming practice revealed both the brutality of the slave system and the cultural complexity of the empire. Upon being freed, slaves could adopt a full Roman name, which represented a significant change in their social status. They often took the first name and nomen of their former masters, maintaining a symbolic link with the family that had previously owned them. For example, a slave named Felix, who belonged to a master named Marcus Tullius, might adopt the name Marcus Tullius Felix upon gaining his freedom. This act was both a form of gratitude and a strategy for social advancement, since the master's name conferred prestige and protection on the freedman. This transition from slave to freedman also raises intriguing questions about identity and memory. Did the freedmen see their new names as a rebirth or as a constant reminder of their former condition? This tension is illustrated by historical records and inscriptions that show freed slaves celebrating their rise to prominence, but also remembering their origins. Many chose to keep their old names as cognomen, blending past and present into a new identity. Another interesting aspect is the relationship between slaves' names and their roles within Roman society. Slaves who held higher positions, such as administrators or tutors, often had names that reflected their role or value. For example, a slave educator might be called pedagogus, while an estate administrator might be called villicus. These names were not only descriptive, but also demonstrated how a slave's role influenced his or her perception within the social hierarchy. In some cases, slaves' names were also used to convey humor or irony. Roman masters, known for their biting sense of humor, sometimes gave slaves names that contrasted with their reality. A frail-looking slave, for example, might be called Hercules. These names, while seemingly mild at first glance, reveal the dehumanization embedded in the slave system, where even a person's identity could be the subject of ridicule. Slaves also played an essential role in the preservation and transmission of culture within Rome. Many were educated and brought knowledge from their homelands, enriching Roman society. These slaves, often Greek or Oriental, introduced new philosophical, artistic, and literary ideas. Despite their condition of servitude, they contributed to the construction of Rome's cultural legacy. The names of these slaves often remained in historical and literary records, allowing their stories to be remembered even centuries later. When we consider the impact of slave names in ancient Rome, it becomes clear that they were more than functional labels. They represented a system of control, but also a narrative of resistance and transformation. By adopting Roman names after their liberation, many slaves created new identities that symbolized their integration into society and their overcoming of the limitations imposed by the slave system. This transformation leads us to reflect on the power of names as markers of identity and agency in the midst of oppression. As we continue with this analysis, it is impossible not to wonder about the connections between these names and those of Roman emperors, who often manipulated their own identities by naming themselves strategically. How did the power of names, for both slaves and rulers, shape perceptions of status, authority, and belonging in ancient Rome? This connection between the names of the humblest and the most powerful reveals a society deeply concerned with the image and meaning of words, where even the simplest name could convey a world of stories and possibilities. The names of Roman emperors were not just a form of identification, but veritable tools of power, strategy, and propaganda. Unlike ordinary citizens or freed slaves, emperors used their names as symbols of legitimacy, continuity, and even divinity. Each name carried an implicit message, carefully chosen to consolidate power and reinforce authority. But what motivated them to manipulate their own identities? And how did these names shape public perceptions of Rome's rulers? The practice of changing or adopting new names among emperors began to gain prominence with Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Born Gaius Octavius, he became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian after being adopted by Julius Caesar. However, it was the title Augustus that truly transformed his identity. Augustus was derived from Augustus, a term associated with the sacred and divine, and gave him an aura of celestial authority. With this simple addition, he was not just a political leader, but a near-divine figure, legitimized by higher powers. This example set a powerful precedent for subsequent rulers. Throughout Rome's history, many emperors followed suit, using their names as a way to associate themselves with prestigious historical figures or to create a new public image. Emperor Caligula, for example, whose real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, adopted the nickname Caligula in reference to the small military boots he wore as a child. This name, initially an affectionate form of identification, ended up becoming the symbol of one of the most controversial reigns in Roman history. The use of additional nicknames or titles allowed emperors to shape their images according to their political and social needs. Another striking example is Nero, whose full name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Nero made a point of maintaining elements that connected him to previous dynasties, such as the Julii and Claudii, to reinforce his legitimacy. He also promoted his own image as an artist and patron of the arts, as reflected in coins, sculptures, and monuments that bore his name. However, his name also became synonymous with tyranny and misrule, showing how public perception can transform even the most carefully chosen of names. The strategic use of names was not limited to creating a strong image. It was also used as a form of propaganda during times of crisis. After the famous Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD, when Rome was shaken by successive changes of rulers, Vespasian took power and made a point of adopting the title Imperator Caesar Vespasianus Augustus, reaffirming both his position as a military commander and his connection to the imperial tradition. This practice of reinforcing continuity was crucial to stabilizing the empire during times of political instability. Interestingly, emperors' names also reveal how they attempted to shape narratives about themselves and their reigns. Emperor Trajan, for example, was known as Marcus Ulpius Traianus, but his adoption of the title Optimus Princeps, the best leader, was a way to highlight his military and administrative achievements. This choice of title was not only symbolic, but also a way to gain popular support and build a lasting legacy. Similarly, Hadrian, known for his love of Greek arts and culture, used his name and titles to highlight his image as a learned and sophisticated ruler, distinguishing himself from his predecessors. In addition to titles associated with grandeur and divinity, some emperors also adopted names that evoked myths and founding stories of Rome. Emperor Romulus Augustulus, for example, combined two of the most symbolic names in Roman history: Romulus, the legendary founder of the city, and Augustus, the title of the first emperor. Although his reign was brief and marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, his name symbolized a complete cycle, connecting the beginning and end of imperial history. It should not be forgotten that imperial names not only reflected the ambitions of rulers, but also shaped the way they were remembered by history. Commodus, for example, sought to associate himself directly with Hercules, even calling himself Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus, Herculeus Romanus, ex Superatorius, Amazonius, Invictus Felix Pius. Despite his attempts to connect himself with an image of strength and divinity, he is remembered more for his eccentricity than for his achievements. This contrast shows how a name can be a powerful tool, but also a double-edged sword. By analyzing the names of Roman emperors, we realize that they were much more than simple labels. They functioned as statements of power, propaganda strategies, and often as tools for rewriting personal and dynastic histories. This practice of manipulating names and identities reveals a society that was deeply aware of the impact of words and symbolism. But it also begs the question, to what extent did these names influence the way rulers were viewed by their contemporaries? And how did the names chosen by emperors resonate through the centuries, shaping our understanding of Roman history? Roman nomenclature was not only a reflection of its time, but also a testament to the cultural, social, and political evolution of Rome and, later, the Western world. From the beginning of the Roman Republic to the end of the Empire, Roman names underwent many transformations, accompanying structural changes that shaped history. But what happened to this meticulous system over time? How did it resist and adapt to external influences and the needs of an ever-changing society? One of the most striking changes in the Roman naming system occurred with the spread of Christianity. Before that, Roman names often referred to deities, virtues, or military conquests. However, as Christian influence grew, these elements were gradually replaced by names that honored saints and martyrs. This movement marked a significant break with pagan traditions and helped to cement the empire's new cultural identity. For example, names such as Petrus, Peter, and Paulus, Paul, began to gain prominence, symbolizing not only religious belief, but also the new order that was emerging in the Roman world. Another factor that influenced the evolution of Roman names was the invasion of barbarian peoples, such as the Goths, Visigoths, and Huns. These groups brought with them their own traditions and naming systems, which eventually became intertwined with Roman names. This fusion created a new cultural dynamic in which traditional Roman names coexisted with names of Germanic and other origins. The integration of these names was a reflection of the political and cultural alliances formed during this period of transition. For example, names such as Theodoric, which has Germanic roots, began to spread in regions that had previously strictly followed Roman conventions. Over time, especially during the Middle Ages, the Roman naming system underwent considerable simplification. The praenomen structure, with its given name, nomen, and cognomen, was gradually abandoned. Instead, people began to adopt single names, or in some cases, a combination of first and last names that indicated occupation, geographical origin, or lineage. This process not only reflected social change, but also marked the beginning of practices that we still recognize today, such as the adoption of surnames based on occupations, such as ferrera, related to blacksmiths, or locations, such as campos. Despite all these changes, many Roman names managed to survive, adapting to different languages and cultures. Names such as Julius, Marcus, Claudia, and Livia remain popular today, carrying with them echoes of a rich and multifaceted history. These names have been shaped by centuries of use and reinterpretation, taking on new meanings and contexts with each generation. This continuity is a testament to the enduring impact of Roman culture, which still permeates our lives in subtle and profound ways. Another fascinating aspect is how the Roman naming system influenced practices in other places and historical periods. For example, during the Renaissance, there was a resurgence of interest in classical culture, which led many noble European families to adopt Latin names as a way of demonstrating learning and sophistication. This movement helped preserve the memory of Roman names and integrate them into new cultural narratives. Even in the Americas, which were colonized centuries later, names of Latin origin continued to be used, often in honor of historical or religious figures. On the other hand, it is intriguing to observe how the symbolic significance of Roman names has been reinterpreted over time. In literature, for example, authors such as Shakespeare often used Roman names to evoke themes of honor, betrayal, and power. In his plays, names such as Julius Caesar and Brutus were not only characters, but also symbols of universal ideas that resonated with their audiences. This literary use has helped keep Roman names alive, even in contexts completely different from their origin. In modern times, Roman names continue to inspire parents around the world. Often these names are chosen for their elegant sound, their historical connections, or their intrinsic meaning. People often associate names like Augustus with grandeur and authority, while names like Flavia evoke delicacy and sophistication. This continued popularity demonstrates how Roman names have transcended the barriers of time and space, remaining relevant and meaningful. However, the question remains, to what extent do the names we use today still carry the original intentions of the Romans? Are we aware of the historical and cultural weight they carry when we choose a name like Martius or Cecilia? Or have these names simply become pleasant sounds, disconnected from their roots? Reflecting on these questions helps us to see how Roman nomenclature is more than a vestige of the past. It is a living, breathing part of our collective identity. And by thinking about the names we give and receive, perhaps we can find new ways to connect with history and understand how it shapes who we are and how we present ourselves to the world. Your opinion makes all the difference to us. So like, comment, share this video with someone special and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can create a community full of amazing ideas and inspiring stories. We can't wait to see what you have to say.